Hello, welcome to the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens. This is a special place in the history of West Palm Beach, in the history of the art world, and in the history of Florida. Today, we're going to be sharing a story that took place in this very area years ago. My friends and I will read to you in this secret garden the story of Charlie Pierce, the American jungle. Welcome to artist Ann Norton's jungle. Come with me. This book tells the story of South Florida's early pioneer history through some of the real-life experiences of Charlie Pierce. Pierce's adventures as a young boy were recorded in diaries that he maintained throughout his life. The diaries were later consolidated into a manuscript. To write this book, the author, who is the great-grandnephew of Charlie Pierce, Harvey Oyer, utilized that manuscript, as well as stories passed down through 5 generations of his family. From the time of his arrival in 1872 at the age of 8 years old until his death in 1939, Charlie Pierce led one of the most intriguing and exotic lives imaginable. His adventures as a young boy growing up in the wild, untamed frontier of Florida became legendary. Perhaps no other man in Florida's history experienced firsthand as many important events and met as many influential characters as he did. The young people reading today with me in Ann Norton's garden are young people who, full of adventure through their growing up years, have loved this garden as many visitors do today. First, Chapter 1, you will meet Miss Vanessa Bennett.
Chapter 1, Down the River. Mama and Papa were in the orange grove pruning tree branches as the mid-morning sun rose and heated their backs. I followed close behind, picking up fallen oranges and loading them in a heavy burlap sack. The bumblebees were hard at work too, flying from orange blossom to orange blossom. I reached up to swat away a bumblebee near my head when Mama shrieked. I thought she had been stung by one of the swarming bees, but to my horror she was pointing across the grove towards the black smoke billowing from the roof of our old wooden house. Papa ran as fast as he could towards the house, grabbing a shovel and a bucket of water from near the outhouse. Mama raced behind him so quickly that she almost passed him. Together they tried to extinguish the raging inferno with buckets of water, but Mama and Papa could not refill the bucket at the pond, get across the yard, and throw the water onto the fire fast enough. Papa tried shoveling sand onto the fire to smother it. They knew their efforts were hopeless, but they kept fighting anyways. After all, this house and the few meager possessions inside it were all we had. The house was made of a type of pine wood that contained natural oils. I didn't know much about Florida woods yet, and Papa later told me these oils were very flammable. Once a fire started with this kind of wood, there was almost no chance of putting it out. The Seminole Indians who lived nearby called this type of pine lighter wood. They used it to start campfires and cooking fires. We had just moved into the house a month ago. It was 2 stories tall with a wraparound porch on the first floor. The wood floors creaked and strips of peeling paint hung from the walls. The house and the orange grove had been abandoned when we found them. Mama and Papa had spent a month cleaning and repairing the house and trying to restore the orange grove so that it would be productive again. Now the house was gone. In what seemed like an instant, we went from having a house and a future to having nothing at all. All our clothes and possessions were gone. Not that I had many possessions, only a couple of clothes, 3 books, and a modern wooden sailboat. Papa was very upset. After all, he had convinced Mama to move from the big city of Chicago to the wilderness frontier in Florida. We had no neighbors and no friends here. In fact, other than a few Seminole Indians, there were no other people within 50 miles. We did not talk much to the Seminole Indians. A few years ago, a band of Seminoles had massacred a family of white settlers near here as revenge for a white settler shooting a Seminole boy. After that, all the other white settlers moved away. This is probably why our house had been abandoned. I know Papa felt like he had let us down, but Mama and I, only 8 years old, were going to have to sleep on the ground. We had no food, no clothes, and no idea how we were going to make ends meet. But Mama didn't let Papa stew on it for too long. "Don't worry," she said, "God will provide for us." I believed her. After all, we hadn't spent a year sailing down the Mississippi River, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, and trekking down the east coast of Florida to give up now. But Mama and Papa had come from big, wealthy families in the North. Papa was even related to President Franklin Pierce, and Mama had been a school teacher. I knew Mama's family was worried about her moving into the jungle because they sent down boxes and boxes of magazines whenever they could so we wouldn't have something to read. School was very important in my house, and Mama was teaching me how to read and write. By early afternoon, the house was a smoldering pile of ashes. Only the stone fireplace and part of the charred chimney remained. It was going to be hot. All the morning dew had already evaporated, and waves of heat were rising from the ground. I played with my shoelaces while Papa paced nervously at the edge of the grove. Toot toot! 2 toots of an air horn meant the steamboat was approaching on the river. Our house, or what was left of it, sat on the west bank of the Indian River, just south of Fort Pierce. Twice a week, a small steamboat delivered mail, news from the outside world, and any food that we had ordered from Mr. Titus's store upriver at Sand Point. The steamer was coming from the south, headed back to Sand Point. Papa waved the steamer down and told Captain Brevard what had happened. Captain Brevard looked over the ruin of our house and then said, "Well, I just came from the Jupiter Lighthouse, downriver about 40 miles. They need a new assistant lighthouse keeper if you're interested." "Can you take us?" Papa asked immediately. Captain Brevard agreed. Soon he had turned his boat around and we were headed down the Indian River, leaving behind the smoldering pile of ash that had been our house. We grabbed what few possessions we had left and set off for a brighter future.
Let's move on to Chapter 2, Shipwreck, read by Regan Oberting.
Chapter 2, Shipwreck. We had a fair wind at our backs, and we made good time down the river. It was October, 1872, and the heavy rains from last summer had raised the water level of the Indian River so that Captain Brevard could safely get his boat downriver. During the drier times of the year, some parts of the river became too shallow to cross. We reached the Jupiter Lighthouse before nightfall. The lighthouse is located at the intersection of 3 bodies of water: the Indian River, the Loxahatchee River, and the Atlantic Ocean. I later found out that the Loxahatchee means River of Turtles in the Seminole language. As we docked, Captain Armour and his assistant, Charles Carlin, were waiting at the end of the long wooden dock. The tall lighthouse rose behind them. I'd never seen a lighthouse up close before, but I knew lighthouses were very important because they helped ship captains see where the shore was so they could avoid wrecking. Captain Armour was the lighthouse keeper, and Mr. Carlin was his assistant. But it took 3 men to operate a lighthouse. After we docked, Papa went ashore to talk to Captain Armour, who said his other assistant had died of yellow fever several weeks ago. He hired Papa on the spot, and we moved right on into a small set of rooms above Captain Armour's house. We felt very fortunate to have found a new job and home on the same day we lost our house to fire. Mama was right. God had provided for us. At first, life at the Jupiter Lighthouse was only a little less lonely than life at the Orange Grove. Mama and I kept up with our lessons every day. I was quickly becoming a good reader, and my books kept me company. But I also wanted to explore the jungles around the lighthouse. Papa and Captain Armour told me the forecast and streams were full of bears, snakes, alligators, and Seminole Indians. Captain Armour didn't seem very interested in exploring, and Papa was busy most of the time. I was desperate to get into the woods, but there was only one other kid around, and she wasn't allowed to explore. Her name was Kate. She was Captain Armour's daughter. We went fishing and swimming every day, but Kate's parents wouldn't let her out of their sight. There were plenty of stories about people getting bitten by alligators or snakes, and her parents were worried that she would just get hurt. Papa took turns minding the lighthouse with Captain Armour and Mr. Carlin. They divided each day into 3 8-hour shifts. Each man worked 1 8-hour shift per day. When Papa was working, I was not supposed to bother him. He had to keep all lenses and mirrors at the top of the lighthouse clean and working. At night, he carried buckets of oil up the narrow, winding stairs of the lighthouse. The oil was burned to create the light that was then magnified by lenses and flashed out to sea to tell passing ships where the shoreline was, so the ships would not run around in the middle of the night. Without the lighthouse, Papa said, ships would wreck offshore and people could get hurt. We were glad for a place to live, but we still didn't have any possessions or clothes. Mama borrowed a few clothes from Captain Armour's wife for us to wear whenever she washed our one set of clothes. While we were getting used to our new home, I watched Mama carefully to see if I could be worried. I knew Papa was trying his hardest, but I also knew from Mama that sometimes Papa was willing to take big risks. Just moving here has been risky. I figured as long as Mama wasn't worried, then I shouldn't be either. During the day, she seemed fine, and she often said, "God will provide for us, Charlie. Don't you worry about a thing." But one night, I was having trouble sleeping. I heard her room. "Dear Lord," she said, "my family has been through so much, and I know I shouldn't ask for this because you will provide for us as you see fit for us. But please, Lord, we have no clothes, nothing of our own. I ask only my son Charlie is giving what he needs to prosper in this foreign land. Thank you, Lord, and amen." Now I knew she was really worried, but was hiding it. I decided right then that I wouldn't let Mama down. I would be strong too. Then I fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night while it was still very dark and heard Papa climbing down from the top of the lighthouse. I could hear a roaring sound, and for a second I was scared. Another fire had started in the lighthouse. I then realized it was the wind outside. Papa banged on Captain Armour's door below. The captain sounded annoyed when he answered. "I think there's a ship on the reef," Papa said. "No," Captain Armour responded. "It's too dark outside, too overcast to see all the way to the reef. There's no ship out there. Now let me get back to sleep." I heard Papa climb back up to the top of the lighthouse. It seemed like a few minutes later when I woke up again and heard Papa banging on Captain Armour's door. "What now?" Captain Armour said. "I'm sure of it," Papa exclaimed excitedly. "There's a ship out there." Papa and Captain Armour climbed into the top of the lighthouse to look out. And just minutes later, there was a lot of noises as they ran down the stairs and woke up Mr. Carlin. "There's a ship on the reef," Captain Armour said. "We need to sail for it and see if they need any help." Mr. Carlin took watch of the lighthouse while Papa and Captain Armour rushed outside into the dark night and rigged out Captain Armour's small sailboat. I desperately wanted to go with them, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be awake, so I just didn't ask. I watched from the small window in my room while Papa and Captain Armour sailed across the river and to the inlet. I could see their white sail bobbing in the waves, and their big breakers coming into the mouth of the river. I strained my eyes to see the ship on the reef, but all I could see was black ocean and the white foam from big waves. Eventually, when I couldn't see anything else, I went back to bed. I was just too excited to sleep in and woke up the first light of dawn. Mr. Carlin was already out on the dock, rigging out his own small sailboat to head into the surf. In the daylight, I could see how big the waves really were. I had seen big storms in Chicago on Lake Michigan, but these were the biggest waves I had ever seen. I could also see the ship sitting on the reef. Huge waves smashed against it, sending white sheets of spray over the rails and deck. I couldn't believe Papa and Captain Armour had sailed into these waves in the middle of the night. I ran outside, passing Mama on the way. "Charlie," she yelled after me, "you need to eat something." I could tell she was worried too. From the way she kept glancing out the window to the inlet, Papa and Captain Armour still had not returned from the ship. "Is Papa going to be all right?" I asked her. "Of course he is," she said. "Now, don't you talk about it anymore." As soon as I was finished with breakfast, I ran outside and down toward the water. By now, Mr. Carlin was already gone, and the dock was empty. But there was something else there. I looked to the southwest to where the Lake Worth Creek empties into the Loxahatchee River. I saw a long canoe coming out of the creek and heading toward the lighthouse. I then saw a second canoe and a third. They kept coming, one after another, until I counted 7 canoes, filled with Seminoles, headed directly toward us. Suddenly, everything Captain Armour had said about the Seminoles went through my mind, and I remembered how they had massacred that other white family up in Fort Pierce. I ran back to the house, yelling, "Mama, Mama, the Indians are coming for us." Miss Armour panicked and cried out, "Oh, I wish the men were here." Just then, we looked in the other direction, toward the inlet, and saw Papa, Captain Armour, and Miss Carlin sailing Mr. Carlin's small boat toward us. It was a race. Who could reach us first, Papa and his colleagues, or the 7 canoes of Indians? Papa and the other men had the wind and tide in their favor, which meant that the Seminoles were rowing against us. The Seminoles paddled as hard as they could, but it soon became clear that Papa, Captain Armour, and Mr. Carlin would reach the dock before the Indians could. Sure enough, Papa, Captain Armour, and Mr. Carlin touched the end of the dock just before the first canoe of Seminoles. The 3 men from the lighthouse were not alone in their small sailboat. They brought with them a man, 2 women, and a child, all huddled under the sun blankets. They were passengers from the ship on the reef. That ship was named the Victor, and it had set sail from New York towards New Orleans. In the middle of the night, the rudder broke, and the captain could no longer steer the boat. The strong southeast wind pushed the boat onto the reef outside the Jupiter Inlet. Papa, Captain Armour, and Mr. Carlin had helped rescue the passengers from the ship before the ship broke apart in the crashing waves. The crew of the ship stayed behind on the beach. Now the 3 lighthouse keepers, plus the people from the Victor, joined me and Mama on the dock, watching the canoes full of Seminoles gliding silently towards us.
And now, Chapter 3, Meeting the Seminoles, read by Henry Horgan.
Chapter 3, Meeting the Seminoles. As soon as they touched the dock, the Seminole Indians leaped from their canoes and stood facing us on the dock. I was surprised to see the group wasn't just Seminole warriors. They had also brought their wives, whom they called Tykees, and their children, whom they called Yatuchis. This was the first time I'd ever seen Indians up close, and even though Mama always said it was rude to stare, I couldn't help myself. Anyway, I noticed that the adults were also staring, and Captain Armour looked angry. Mama wrapped her arm around me and pulled me close while the group from the Victor stood back and huddled together. They had never seen Indians before either. I felt a heavy hand fall on my shoulder and looked up to see Papa. He didn't look scared or angry, just curious. He winked at me. The Seminoles wore very colorful clothing that covered them from head to toe. I could see only the dark, smooth skin of their faces and hands. Their eyes were very dark. The Seminoles were not tall like Papa, but their faces looked worn and tough. They did not smile much. "What do you want here?" Captain Armour demanded. One of the men stepped forward and looked Captain Armour in the eye. I learned later that Seminoles always stare straight into your eyes when they're talking. "The ship," he said. "We heard ship stuck on reef." The people from the Victor rustled, and the man started to say something, but Captain Armour held up his hand for silence. The Tykees and the Yatuchis watched without expression on their dark faces. "So there is," said Captain Armour, "but she's still riding the reef. It'll be a few days at least." The Indian nodded, and it seemed that he and Captain Armour had just made some kind of agreement. But I didn't know what it was. "Fine," the Seminole said. "We will camp upriver." As he turned to leave, I noticed a boy about my own age standing just behind him. The boy was a little shorter than me, and was standing all alone with his chin sticking out fiercely. Suddenly, I felt embarrassed because Mama was still holding me, and I squirmed out of her hold and stared back at the boy. He was dressed like the adults, in long pants that went to his ankles, and his feet were bare. He had a necklace around his neck with some kind of bone hanging from it, and he had light streaks in his hair. He seemed just as interested in me as I was in him, and while the rest of his people climbed into canoes, he took a few steps forward, toward me. I noticed that his legs were a little curved out. I wanted to back away and hide behind Mama. After all, I knew that Indians killed white people all the time. Everyone knew about it, but I also didn't want to look scared. When he got within a few steps of me, he stopped and smiled, then stuck out his hand as if he wanted to shake hands. Behind me, I heard Papa whisper, "Well, I'll be darned, look at that." That made me feel very brave, so I extended my hand and shook the boy's hand. In very broken English, he said, "I am called Tiger Bowlegs." "I'm Charlie Pierce," I answered. Tiger looked out to the ocean where the Victor was still being soaked with spray. "You sail on ship?" "No," I said. "I live here in the Lighthouse." He nodded. "Very tall." "Yeah, but it's boring most of the time. Nothing to do around here." Tiger smiled at me. "Plenty to do. Maybe I show you." I don't even remember what I answered because I was so excited. Just a year ago, I'd been sitting in my classroom in Chicago, and now I was in the wilds of South Florida talking about exploring the jungles with a real Indian. Suddenly, I heard an Indian man call out, "Tiger, come." Tiger left right away and climbed into a canoe with a group of Seminoles. Within a few minutes, the whole group of Seminoles was back in their canoes and headed toward the Lake Worth Creek. But they did not go back to the Everglades where they lived. Instead, they camped for the next 2 nights along the banks of the Lake Worth Creek. I could see the smoke from their campfire. 2 more days of strong winds and rough seas followed. Each pounding wave did more damage to the Victor. There was no chance of getting it off the reef. Every day, Captain Armour and Papa sailed out to check on the ship, and every day, a canoe full of Seminoles paddled into the river mouth to watch. They were all waiting for the ship to break apart. Finally, on the 3rd day, the first planks from the Victor began to float up on the beach. Captain Armour and Mr. Carlin took a boat across the river to the inlet to collect the goods washing up on the beach, while Papa did lighthouse duty. At about noon, a strong incoming tide began pulling all the goods through the inlet toward the lighthouse. I hollered for Papa, who was eating lunch. He dropped his knife and fork and ran to the end of the dock. Jumping in the other boat, Papa headed into the river to grab as many of the items as he could. There were barrels and boxes of all shapes and sizes going in every direction. 2 large boxes were grounded near the dock. Papa left those 2 alone, knowing that they would not float any farther. All the items were being washed toward the Lake Worth Creek, toward the Seminoles' camp. This was the event they had waited for patiently, and they were coming into the river again in their canoes. 2 Seminoles almost had a large trunk in their canoe when Papa pulled alongside their canoe and yelled, "Stop! That one is mine." The Seminoles did not argue. They simply let the trunk go. There were so many boxes and barrels in the river that it was not worth arguing over any of them. Papa knew what was in the trunk from the writing on the side. It was a Wheeler and Wilson sewing machine. The Seminoles would have no use for it. Papa got in his boat and Mama used it for many years thereafter. Papa filled his small boat with boxes and trunks so heavy they nearly sank his boat before he could get back to the dock. Every Seminole filled his canoe, too, and there were still more boxes slowly floating up the Loxahatchee River and the Lake Worth Creek. The wreck of the Victor was a bonanza for everyone. Papa returned with 10 100-pound barrels of butter, which the 3 families shared for more than a year by soaking the unused butter in brine and burying the barrels in the sand until more butter was needed. More important to Mama and me, one of the two large trunks near the end of the dock contained 50 brand new men's suits, and the other box contained reams of fine white linen. Mama's prayer had been answered. We now had clothes. In fact, we had more and nicer clothes than we had ever had in our lives. With the sewing machine, Mama was able to alter the men's suits and make new outfits from the linen. We dressed like kings. Many boxes of what Papa called Plantation Bitters were also recovered, and many more floated upriver. Plantation Bitters was a drink that contained a lot of whiskey and was bottled in 1-quart bottles that looked like small log cabins. Papa, Mr. Carlin, and Captain Armour stored the boxes of Plantation Bitters in the storehouse and drank them with moderation. The Seminoles also recovered many boxes of Plantation Bitters. On one occasion in the middle of the night, Big Tommy, who was the largest and fiercest of the Seminoles, wandered up to the lighthouse and demanded that we must give him our Plantation Bitters. I think he must have been drunk. Captain Armour, who was not a big man, looked Big Tom in the eye and said, "We have no Wyoming whiskey." "Go back to camp, Big Tommy." After asking a few more times and receiving the same answer from Captain Armour, Big Tommy reluctantly got back in his canoe, lay down, and began singing. His melody became fainter and fainter as his canoe drifted back upriver. Not long afterward, a couple of white men we had never seen before came downriver to the lighthouse. They had stopped at the Seminole village and drunk Plantation Bitters with the Indians the day before. One of the Seminoles, named Charlie Cypress, told the white men that Big Tommy had been one of the band of Seminoles who killed a white family at Mosquito Lagoon a few years back. When the other Seminoles learned that Charlie Cypress had told white men this secret, they were angry at Charlie Cypress, but also scared of what the white men might do. Sometimes the U.S. Army was called in to deal with Indians who killed white people. They might arrest Big Tommy. Several days later, a canoe with 4 Seminole village elders arrived at the lighthouse. The elders wanted to talk to Captain Armour. They begged Armour not to report Big Tommy or the other Seminoles to the Big Chief in Washington. They didn't want the army to attack their villages or take Big Tommy away. They admitted the story was true, but said, "Many moons have passed. White men and Indians now friends. No want fight anymore. Please, no tell Big Chief in Washington." Captain Armour told the elders that he would not report them to Washington, and that the Seminoles and white men were now friends. He had to repeat it many times before the Seminole elders believed him. Eventually, the elders departed in their canoes. After almost 42 years of war between the Seminoles and the white men, there would never be any fighting between them again. The elders returned to their village and held a tribal council. They sentenced Charlie Cypress to exile from the village for telling the Big Tommy story to white men. Charlie Cypress was banished from the village for the remainder of his life. He also had one of his earlobes cut off as a mark of dishonor. He lived alone in the woods for the rest of his days and was known to the settlers as Crop-Eared Charlie.
The adventure continues with Chapter 4, Tiger Bowlegs, read by Emmanuel Bravo.
Chapter 4, Tiger Bowlegs. Life got a lot better after the Victor, but it wasn't because of my new clothes or even the sewing machine that Papa fished out of the river. It was because of Tyler Bowlegs. A few days after the Victor came apart, I was playing outside by the lighthouse when I heard a short whistle from the trees by the riverbank. At first I thought it was a bird, but then I heard it again. I walked toward the trees and saw Tiger Bowlegs hiding in the shadow of a big oak tree and waving toward me. I ran into the woods. It was hard talking to Tiger at first. I didn't understand him very well, so we both had to talk real slow. I asked why he was hiding in the woods, and he said he was afraid to come out where the white men could see him. I tried to tell him that he didn't have anything to worry about from Papa, Mr. Carlin, and Captain Amore, but he said that Seminoles have been tricked plenty of times by white men. Tiger said the U.S. Army had once burned down his family banana trees in their fields of corn. This happened when the lighthouse we lived in was being built. In revenge, his grandfather led an attack against the workers at the lighthouse and the army soldiers. This started a war between his tribe and the U.S. Army. It was later called the Third Seminole War. "What happened?" I asked. "Did you win?" Tiger looked fierce and stuck out his chin, but he said, "No, Seminole never win white men fighting." "Why not?" I asked. Too many guns, he replied. Tiger told me that the Seminoles and white men had been fighting on and off for many years, since before the time of his father's father. His father's father's father. It took me a few minutes to figure that out. He meant his great-grandfather. But Seminoles don't keep track of time like we do. They follow the moons instead of years. So Tiger didn't even know how old he was in years. I just guessed he was somewhere around my age. I didn't like the idea of white people fighting Indians, and Tiger said sometimes there would be whole years would go by. There would be whole years, and there would be no fighting. But then something would happen, like Big Tommy killing the white people, or the army burning a Seminole village, and then there would be a lot of killing. Are you going to kill me? I asked, mostly joking. No, you my friend. I saw Tiger pretty often after that. He and his father came to the Lighthouse to trade buckskins, bear pelts, and raccoon hides for items such as clothing, tools, and various foods. One time, Papa let me come along to Tiger's village and get a load of furs. This was the first time I'd seen an Indian village, and I couldn't believe how different it was from the houses I was used to. Tiger and his family's house had no walls, a roof, and the roof was made from dried palmetto fronds. They slept on a wooden platform a few feet off the ground. He said they did this so the animals and snakes could not get to them while they slept. In the middle of the village was another big house with a fire pit in the center, where everyone cooked. Once Mama and Papa learned to trust Tiger, they let us roam through the woods around the lighthouse. We explored many creeks and little rivers flowing into Bollocks, and Indian rivers. We camped, climbed trees, used wild vines to swing from tree to tree, built forts in the woods, hunted rabbits, collected alligator eggs, and learned to make turkey calls so good that even the turkeys were confused. Tiger knew the woods, the river, and the animals better than any white man did. He taught me how to hunt, how to move through the woods without making any noise, and how to mask the human smell on my body with mud and plants so the deer could not smell us. He also taught me how to carve crabwood into perfectly straight spears. Then he showed me how to crawl out on the edges of mangrove tree branches without casting a shadow over the water. From there, we could spear the fish in the river as they swam below us. Mama said it was okay if I played with Tiger, but she also said she wasn't going to let me turn into a little Indian. Every day, I had to sit with her in the lighthouse and study my books and learn to write. But Mama was smart. To keep me interested, she had her relatives in Chicago send books on geography, biology, and plants and animals. So, while Tiger taught me the Seminole words for alligator, turtle, and river, I also learned the school words for the same thing, even the Latin words. One day, Papa walked in during a lesson. He laughed a big laugh and said I was going to think like a white man, but live like a Seminole. That was one thing about Papa. He never said anything bad towards the Seminoles, and he was friendly towards Tiger and his father. He told me the Seminoles knew how to live with the land, not against it, and I was lucky to learn from a real Indian. I spent as much time with Tiger as I could. One of our favorite places was a large shell mountain on the other side of the inlet from the lighthouse. It was a big hill made from old oyster shells, along with bones, arrowheads, burnt wood, broken turtle shells, and axe heads. We liked to climb onto the top and look out over the trees and water. Tiger taught me how to weave green palmetto fronds into mats so we could slide from the top of the shell mountain all the way to the bottom. If it had just rained and the shells were slippery, we had to jump off our mats before plunging into the river. Tiger's father once told us that the Shell Mountain was once home to the group of Indians who called themselves the Hobe. The shells, bones, and tools belonged to the Hobe, who lived there long before the Seminoles had arrived. According to Tiger's father, the Hobe had kept a white man named Jonathan Dickinson and his family captive at this site after Mr. Dickinson's ship had wrecked north of the inlet. It took Dickinson and his family more than a year to escape and walk north along the beach to St. Augustine. If only the people on board the Victor knew how lucky they were to be rescued by Papa, Mr. Carlin, and Captain Amor, rather than a band of wild Indians. About 25 years later, after my family moved away from the lighthouse, a family named Dubois would build a large house on top of that shell mountain.
Now moving on to Chapter 5. A Lost Rifle is Found. Read by George Oberting.
Chapter 5. A lost rifle is found. Even though the fighting between the Seminoles and the white men was over, there were still plenty of reminders of what happened. Just a little ways away from our lighthouse, a point of land stuck into the Loxahatchee River. There was an old, abandoned fort on this island. Captain Armour said the fort used to be called Fort Jupiter. The Seminoles and the U.S. Army had fought over the fort for a long time before the lighthouse was even built. Tiger knew about the fort too, because his grandfather had actually attacked it during the Second Seminole War. Because the fort had been made of wood and because of the extreme humidity, the fort was mostly destroyed. In Florida, winter was almost like summer in Chicago, and the weather was nice almost every day. But by April, Mama was already complaining about the heat, and the grown-up men wore loose shirts or no shirts at all and sweated all day, every day. Pretty soon, the rain started, and I learned what Captain Armour meant when he said that summer in Florida is like being a lobster in a pot. It was very, very hot, and it rained almost every day in the late afternoon. Tiger never seemed bothered by the heat. He thought it was funny when he saw Papa with a red face and sweat rolling down his neck. He said Indians weren't bothered by the heat. Papa and Mr. Carlin also complained because the heat and the dampness destroyed wood so fast. They had to constantly repair the house. The lighthouse was fine because it was made from brick. Because no one was fixing the old fort, however, it was mostly ruined. Much of it had fallen down, the roof had caved in, and the rotten walls were full of animals and all kinds of huge bugs. But I thought it was the best place to play anywhere around. Tiger and I spent whole afternoons pretending to attack and defend the fort. I was usually a U.S. Army officer, and he played his grandfather, who actually did attack the fort many moons ago. Tiger was good at this game. Seminoles can move through the forest without making any sound at all, and he snuck up on me all the time. We tried to switch our roles a few times, but it didn't work. I was too loud to be a Seminole, and Tiger didn't like playing a U.S. Army officer. He said it made him unhappy to pretend to kill Seminoles. When we weren't in the fort, we sometimes went exploring up the river. Tiger had his own small canoe. His father made it for him out of a log cypress wood that he hollowed out. Tiger taught me how to sit in the middle and paddle so the canoe wouldn't flip over, and we would glide down the river, pretending to shoot alligators and looking for herons or snook. One day we went further up the river than we had ever before. The oak trees were growing close to the river, and the branches wore Spanish moss like beards. "Listen," Tiger said. "I don't hear anything except the wind." Yes, he told me we were near a haunted place where the wind talked to people. He said it was haunted because many white men and Seminoles died here. It was an old battlefield from the Seminole Wars. He looked nervous because his father had told him never to go to this place. The area was like no other place I had ever seen. The river narrowed and weaved through beautiful oak hammocks that hung over the river. We found a spot along the river to wedge the canoe so it couldn't float away. Then we climbed up the riverbank and walked through the beautiful forest of ancient oak trees. Unlike the fort, which still had walls, cisterns, and wells, the battlefield site was just a grassy meadow. We walked slowly through the haunted forest. "Look," I said, bending over to pick up a used bullet. It turned out the ground was littered with things left over from the battle. We found used bullets, U.S. Army belt buckles, arrowheads, and metal buttons that must have been attached to military uniforms that had long since disintegrated. Pretty soon, we found our first skeleton, half buried under leaves. Tiger and I stood in silence, staring at it. I'd never seen a skeleton before. It looked so small. Overhead, the wind rattled in the oak trees, and I wondered whether the old battlefield really was haunted. There were scraps of clothing still hanging from the mossy old bones, and Tiger pointed silently to an arrowhead logged in a rib. "Soldier," he whispered, his eyes wide. After that, we found a lot more skeletons. A few of them had bullet holes in their skulls where they had been shot. These were dead Seminoles, and I felt bad for Tiger because he said that some of these warriors might have been in his tribe a long time ago. Later, I learned that we had found the graveyard of the greatest battle of the Second Seminole War. The battle occurred in January 1838. Tiger and I didn't talk hardly at all. He was afraid of upsetting the spirits, and I was daydreaming. It seemed as if I could even hear the sounds of the battle in front of the forest around me. I stared into the treetops, trying to understand what the voices were saying. Tiger's father said you had to listen closely to understand the language of the winds. Whap! I snapped out of it when I walked straight into the biggest oak tree I'd ever seen and fell down. I got back up and brushed myself off. Then I checked my cheek to see if I was bleeding. I wasn't. I couldn't believe I didn't see the tree. Its trunk was almost as big around as the lighthouse. The bottom of the trunk was hollow and big enough for a grown man to stand up inside. I was afraid there might be a bear or snakes or some other critter inside the trunk, so I only put my head in slowly. After my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something glitter in one corner. I squinted to see it, but it was all the way in the back of the trunk. I was afraid to walk into the darkness. If I got bit by a snake or attacked by a bear, I didn't want Tiger to have to explain how I died in the one place his father told us to never go. Then I remembered that I had some matches wrapped in a burlap cloth in my back pocket. I removed a match and struck it on the bark of the tree. There were no animals inside. There was nothing inside except a gleaming, perfectly preserved rifle leaned against one of the sides of the trunk. Just as the flame of the match reached my fingers, I grabbed the rifle and ran out of the tree trunk. I yelled for Tiger, and he came running from somewhere deep in the forest. What? Look! I held the rifle up so he could see it. This was no standard issue army rifle. The stock and barrel were engraved with elaborate designs. Engraved on the butt of the rifle was a man's name, Major William Lauderdale. Who's that? Tiger said. I don't know. It sounds familiar, but I don't know who it is. Tiger grunted. We go now, he said. I think he wasn't comfortable about the rifle, or maybe he was just worried his father might find out he had been on the battlefield. If Tiger's father found out, Tiger would never be allowed to play with me again. I took the rifle back to the canoe without even thinking about how I could explain it to Papa where it came from. But I couldn't leave it behind. It was the nicest rifle I had ever seen, and the rifles were expensive. Back at the lighthouse, I told Papa the truth about where rifles came from. He agreed not to tell Tiger's father where he had been. But I knew Papa was unhappy with me for helping Tiger disobey his father. Tiger and I never returned to that battlefield site again. Captain Armour recognized the name William Lauderdale right away. He said that Lauderdale was the officer who commanded a group of soldiers called the Tennessee Volunteers at the battle 35 years ago. He became famous, and a fort farther down the coast was later named for him. Some years later, when I was an adult, I traveled many times to Fort Lauderdale. After we sanded some rust off it and oiled the firing pin, the rifle worked perfectly. Papa kept a watchful eye on my use of it until I got a little older. When I was a teenager, though, I used it almost every day. I kept the rifle for the rest of my life. While I would own other rifles during my lifetime, none ever fired as true, straight, and far as old Lauderdale.
Chapter 6, Hurricane, read by Gracie Hanks.
Chapter 6, Hurricane. I liked the lighthouse, but I knew we wouldn't be staying there forever. It was because of Papa. I heard him say often enough that he was an adventurer, and he often said he had no intention of living out his days in a lighthouse. But living at the lighthouse sounded pretty good to me, especially because I didn't know what else we would do. Whenever I complained to Mama that I didn't want to move and that I liked the lighthouse, she always smiled and said, "Yes, but that's not how your Papa lives." She said that as if it was a good thing. Mama meant that Papa was an adventurer. My Papa came from wealthy, well-educated people in New England, but he had run away from home when he was 16 to find excitement. As a teenager, he sailed on clipper ships around the world. He lived in Australia during the gold rush of the 1840s, saw pygmies in Papua New Guinea, was shipwrecked in the Florida Keys in the 1860s, was a scout in the Black Hawk Indian Wars, and was an officer in the Union Army in the American Civil War. In fact, he had met Mama only because he was shipwrecked on the shores of Lake Michigan after a terrible storm. Mama's parents took him in after the storm, and he fell in love with their daughter. So when a few men showed up at the lighthouse and started talking about Lake Worth to the south of us, I knew something was about to happen because I saw Papa get excited. Papa kept them at the dinner table one night until very late, asking all kinds of questions. What's the water like? Are there turkeys in the woods? How are the Indians down there? I knew I shouldn't be listening, but I couldn't help it. I slipped out of bed and crept to the door so I could hear. The men told Papa that Lake Worth was like a paradise. They said the water was clear and warm and filled with fish and oysters. The woods were full to bursting with wild turkey, deer, and other game. Better yet, one of the men said the government was giving land away for free. It was called homesteading, and it meant that if a man filled a claim with the state land office in Gainesville, he could have 160 acres of land as long as he agreed to live on it. The next day at breakfast, Papa set down his fork and smiled at me. He was smiling, but he looked serious at the same time. I got nervous. "Charlie," he said, "those men yesterday told me about a place just to the south of here where we can build a real home on a big lake and live on our own land. It's called Lake Worth, and we're going to move there." Mama was watching me closely, too. I had to act surprised at first, as if I hadn't already known, because I had been eavesdropping. But the truth was, I was angry. I didn't want to leave. I liked Captain Armour and Kate and Mr. Carlin, but most of all, I liked Tiger Bowlegs. From what Papa said, there weren't any kids down at Lake Worth. From what he said, there wasn't anybody at all down there. And he said that as if it was a good thing. Then it got even worse. Papa said he wouldn't be getting his $33 per month salary anymore for working at the Lighthouse, so we would have to get by on hunting, fishing, farming, and salvaging items from the occasional shipwreck. We were truly going to be pioneer settlers on the lake. I didn't say much about his plans. Secretly, I hoped they wouldn't work out. But things moved pretty fast after that. When I told Tiger we would be moving to Lake Worth, he looked sad. He said that his family almost never went that far south, so we probably wouldn't see each other much after I moved. Meanwhile, Mama and Papa started getting ready for the big move. The year before, Papa had salvaged the lifeboat from the wreck of the Victor. He rigged it with a set of sails and named it Victor II, in honor of its destroyed mothership. The Victor II was not a good sailing vessel. It had been built as a lifeboat with no centerboard and no deep keel. Papa also built a 12-foot-long skiff from white pine lumber salvaged from the wreck. This would be the tender boat to Victor II. Papa's plans was to sail the Victor II west along the Loxahatchee River to the Lake Worth Creek and then to the top of Lake Worth. On the day that we left, Captain Armour came down to the dock to say goodbye. He looked worried. "Are you sure you know where you're going?" he said, looking up the river to the jungle. "Sure," Papa said. "It's only about 7 miles to the top of Lake Worth. The Indians say there's a passage through the Lake Worth Creek. Can't be that hard to find a way through." "I don't know," Captain Armour said, looking doubtful. "There's a swamp between here and there. It might get easy to be lost in that place." But Papa just laughed and slapped me on the shoulder. "We'll be fine," he said. "After all, little Charlie here is about half Indian by now." I didn't say anything. I just sat in the bow of our little boat, wishing we didn't have to leave. But too soon, Captain Armour shoved us off from the dock, and they all waved as we sailed west, up the river to join up with the Lake Worth Creek. We sailed the first mile with a pretty good wind and the jungle sliding by on both banks. The air was full of birds and insects, and I restrained my eyes to see into the dark trees just in case Tiger Bowlegs was hiding. But he wasn't. When we hit the Lake Worth Creek, a strong headwind kicked up from the south, pushing us backward. Papa dropped the sails and glanced at the sky. Mama looked up too. I thought she looked a little nervous, but she didn't say anything. Now that we couldn't sail anymore, Papa had to row. So he got onto the skiff and towed me and Mama in the Victor II behind him. It was slow, hard work. Papa was soon sweating through his shirt, and I could hear him puffing, even from the Victor II. We were able to raise the sails a few times when the river turned west again, but Papa mostly spent the whole afternoon dragging me and Mama and everything we owned up the creek. Papa's goal was to reach an old Indian campground near the head of the creek, where he said there was a set of rapids and separated the creek from the great swamp and reeds called Sawgrass that spread out in every direction. Somewhere on the other side of the Sawgrass swamp was the northern edge of Lake Worth. We would have to navigate our way through the Sawgrass to find the one and only route that actually reached the lake. The problem was that Papa had never been here before and did not even know the way to the Indian campground, let alone the way through the grass swamp on the other side. We finally reached the old Indian campground, just as the sun was beginning to set. It wasn't a very impressive camp, just a bare dirt hill only a few feet above the waterline and surrounded by the thick jungle. But the ground had been cleared by the Indians, and it was dry, so Papa said it was a good place to camp. He said we'd be here for a few days until he figured out how to get through the Sawgrass swamp to the lake. I didn't like living at the camp. It was very hot at night, and there were so many mosquitoes that we could barely sleep. I woke up over and over that first night because of a mosquito buzzing in my ear. I wanted to be back at the lighthouse in my own bed so badly that I had to fight to keep from crying. Mama tried to cheer me up while Papa was gone during the day, but there was almost nothing for us to do. We couldn't explore the jungle because it was too thick to walk through, and we couldn't get too near the water because it was full of alligators. Lots of times we saw many alligators swim by, and once we saw a reddish snake that must have been 4 feet long. Mama grabbed me and hissed at me to be quiet. She said it was a very dangerous kind of snake that would kill me if it bit me. I already knew that because Tiger had told me about these kinds of snakes, but I didn't say anything. Finally, on the third day, Papa came back early from rowing through the narrow channels by the rapids. He sat down heavily on the dirt and mopped sweat from his face. "Well," said Mama, "did you find a way through? I don't know that we can stand much more of this." Papa sighed. "No, the channels are too narrow for the Victor II. I guess we'll have to row the skiff through and leave the big boat here. You're right, we can't stay here much longer. I'll come back with your brother once we find the lake. He and I will just have to figure out a way to get the Victor II to Lake Worth." Uncle Will, Mama's brother, had sailed down the Atlantic coast to meet us at Lake Worth. He was probably already there. I wanted to tell Papa that we should have sailed too, but I didn't say anything. The next morning was sunny and very beautiful. Even Papa remarked on it. There wasn't a whisper of wind in the soft air. Mama packed just enough food in the skiff for one meal, and we set off to find a route through the Sawgrass. She brought a piece of fat pork, some tea, syrup, and a bottle of cognac that had been salvaged from the safe of the Victor shipwreck last year. It was still early morning when Papa began rowing us through the Sawgrass swamp. The sawgrass grew very high, and it looked as if we were going through a tunnel of brown grass. Papa warned me sternly not to grab the giant blades of grass. He said it was called sawgrass for a reason, and I could cut my hand, and there was no doctor anywhere around to fix it. By afternoon, it was hot. I was hot and tired, but I was also worried. Mama and Papa weren't paying much attention, but a few times I had heard animals nearby, running along hidden trails in the swamp. And I had seen flocks of birds flying overhead straight and fast. They were going west. I didn't know much as an Indian, but Tiger said the only way to know the land was to watch the animals. He said animals and birds knew more about the land than even the Indians, and that it was a bad sign whenever you saw an animal do something strange. "Papa," I finally said, "something's wrong." He kept rowing. "What are you talking about?" "What's wrong?" said Mama. "I don't know," I said, "but the birds are acting funny. Tiger says that when the animals act strange, something's wrong, and they're all acting strange. They're flying too straight and fast." Mama and Papa looked at each other, and Papa shrugged. "Well, nothing we can do about the birds," he said. "We'll just have to push through. At least we've got some beautiful weather." Mama nodded and patted my head. But I was right. Something was wrong. The weather didn't stay beautiful for long. A little while later, we got hit by a thunderstorm. It seemed to come out of nowhere, and we heard it before we saw it. The wind whipped through the sawgrass, and the rain struck the water like a drum. The storm swept over us and soaked everything and blew rain into our faces, and then it went away. By this time, the sky was gray, and there were fast-moving clouds. Mama and Papa both looked worried now, and Mama told me to lie down in the bottom of the skiff just in case another storm came. "I've never seen a storm like that," Papa said to Mama. "It was moving so fast." The rest of the afternoon, we kept getting hit with fast-moving storms, and each storm was bigger than the last. The wind and rain started coming constantly, and the air filled with the roar of sawgrass pounding against the water. By late afternoon, the sky was completely black, and the water was sloshing around the bottom of the boat. I was freezing in the strong wind, and even in the small channels, the wind kicked up foamy waves. Papa kept rowing as best he could, but he wasn't making any progress. The wind just pushed us all over the place, and before long, Mama crawled down next to me and wrapped her body around mine to keep me warm and protect me from the bits of flying grass. "Don't worry, baby," she whispered. "We'll be okay. God will protect us." By now, I knew it was a hurricane. Papa had told me about hurricanes. He said the number one rule in a hurricane was not to be stuck outside on the water, and that's just where we were. He fought the oars and cursed, and the water streamed from his face. I saw him, bleeding from a cut on his cheek, where a piece of the sharp grass had hit him. Soon it was night, and the hurricane showed us no sign of passing. The situation was desperate. We were nowhere near land, and we could only see a few feet in front of the skiff. Papa had given up trying to push through the river and was now searching for any dry land. His only light was flashing lightning. Finally, he found a gator trail through the sawgrass. The skiff was wider than even the largest gator, so it took all of the energy Papa had left to push the skiff up the gator trail to a mound of wet dirt a few inches above the waterline. This mound of dirt was where gators lay in the sun to warm themselves on sunny days. It would now be our place of refuge during the hurricane. Papa cleared an opening with his axe. He also cut some palmetto fronds and scattered them on the ground for our beds. It was too wet for a fire, so we ate the fat pork uncooked, together with the syrup. Papa and Mama drank some of the cognac. The wind was now howling of the southeast. Papa turned the skiff over on top of us to protect us from the hurricane. The wind was so powerful that it lifted the skiff up several times, despite Papa and Mama's holding it down from the inside with all their strength. I lay on the wet palm fronds and watched my parents fight the storm. Every so often, something would thud onto the boat, probably a log the wind had picked up. I was more scared than I'd ever been. I was afraid that the wind would pick up the boat and blow us away too. Mama and Papa watched each other as they held on. It was too loud to talk or even yell very often, but I could tell they were scared too. Finally, believe it or not, my eyes began to close and I fell asleep in the middle of the howling hurricane, lying under a little wooden skiff that Papa had built from lumber salvaged from the Victor. I guess I was able to fall asleep because I was too young and naive to understand the danger we were in.
Next up, Chapter 7, Looking for a Home, read by Nina Horgan.
Chapter 7, Looking for a Home. The next morning I woke up and wondered where I was. Then I realized I was still lying on wet palm fronds on the muddy ground underneath the upside-down boat. Mama and Papa were both sleeping. Papa had one arm looped over a bench in the little skiff. Mama was curled up on the ground and covered with mud. Her clothes, which had once been white linen and nice fabric from the men's suits, were filthy and ruined. I realized that Mama and Papa must have held the boat almost all night through the entire storm. I crawled out from underneath the skiff without waking them up. I stood and looked around in amazement. Birds flew over the swamp and a cool breeze was blowing in from the northwest. There were a few high clouds, but it was sunny. The sawgrass had been pounding so loud the night before was standing up and waving in the gentle breeze. I couldn't believe it. The only sign that a hurricane had passed through was the swamp. The water was stirred up to a deep brown and bits of leaves and whole branches floated by. Papa woke up a few minutes later and joined me outside. He looked very tired. His eyes were red and the cut on his cheek was a big scab. His whiskers were growing out and his shirt was torn, but he was smiling. "That was some storm, eh, Charlie?" he said. "Yes, Papa, it sure was." "Well, now we can say we survived a hurricane. Not many people can say that." "I guess not." He thumped on the boat to wake up Mama, then announced it was time for him to leave in the skiff. We were out of food now, and we desperately needed to find a way through the swamp if we wanted to survive. I knew it could get serious if we were lost in the sawgrass. Tiger said that even Indians got lost in the swamp sometimes, and not all of them came back to the village. Mama and I stood on the bank and watched Papa row away again and disappear into the tall sawgrass. But this time he came back an hour later with the good news that the mysterious haulover area between the swamp and the lake was very near. Even in the rain and dark, we had made our way to the edge of the haulover. Once we reached the haulover area, we had another problem. The lake was at least 300 yards from the end of the swamp. The 300 yards in between were all dry land. How would we haul the skiff over 300 yards of dry land? The Seminoles cut the wild pawpaw and used the stalks as skids, which they rolled their canoes over. But there was no pawpaw growing nearby. Papa decided to use brute force and just pull the skiff over the dry land. He did it in spurts of 20 or 30 yards at a time. By the time he reached the top of the lake, he was completely exhausted. He had not slept in more than 24 hours and had eaten only some uncooked fat pork and syrup the night before. Mama and I cheered when Papa finally pushed the skiff into the clear waters of Lake Worth. Then we climbed into the boat and Papa started rowing again. From the water, it was easier to see where the hurricane had destroyed trees, and I saw where one whole tree had been knocked over and was sticking up from the lake. It was filled with big white birds watching the water below. I had no idea where we were going, and Papa just kept rowing. I started to get hungry, but when I complained to Mama, she just said, "Hush now, we'll eat soon enough." "Where?" I asked. "Where are we going?" "Charlie, just let Papa do his work in peace." I could tell she was getting nervous again, and I tried to stop my stomach from growling, but it didn't work. Finally, we saw a house along the shore. Papa pulled the oars into the boat and rested for a minute. He shaded his eyes with his hand. "There it is," he said, grinning, "the Malden house. I was beginning to think we'd never find it here, and we'd have to eat young Charlie here. He was starting to look pretty meaty to me." "Hey," I said, and Mama laughed. "Papa was just joking." I knew Mr. and Mrs. Malden, but not very well. They had visited the Lighthouse a few times while we lived there. That's how Papa knew where they lived. Soon enough, we had docked at their tiny dock, and Papa hailed them from the boat. Mr. Malden appeared in the doorway, followed by Mrs. Malden. I saw that their yard was a mess from the hurricane. A big tree had lost most of its branches, and it looked as if Mr. Malden had spent the morning cutting them up with a handsaw and stacking the wood. Mrs. Malden had tied a kerchief around her head and rolled her sleeves up like a man. She had been cleaning the walls of the house. The Maldens were really nice. They took us in a right way, and Mrs. Malden went to the stove to prepare a quick meal. While we ate, they listened to Papa tell the story of hiding underneath the boat while the hurricane passed by. Mr. Malden leaned back his chair and said, "Well, that's just the most incredible thing I've ever heard. Charlie, your Papa must be the luckiest man on God's green earth." I just nodded. I was very hungry, and I didn't see what was so lucky about getting stuck inside a storm anyway. We ended up staying with the Maldens for a couple of days while Papa recovered his strength. On the third day, we thanked the Maldens and set off down the lake in search of the best land to make our homestead. Several miles down the lake, we spotted a small cabin perched high in the overgrown jungle of the barrier island. We landed the skiff nearby and ventured up to the cabin, shouting, "Hello, is anyone home?" There was nobody. I later found out that the cabin had been built by a German immigrant named Augustus O. Lang. The legend was that Lang was living farther on the north coast of Florida when the American Civil War erupted. Being from Germany, he had no interest in the outcome of an American Civil War, but he was afraid he might get drafted into the Confederate Army and set up north to fight, as he had happened to lots of Irishmen who came to this country during that war. So, to avoid fighting in a war he didn't care about, Lang traveled down to South Florida and hid himself in the vast jungles. He lived alone in this cabin on the barrier island for years, growing his own fruits and vegetables, harvesting fish and oysters, and hunting wild game. As the legend goes, Lang lived so removed from civilization that when the American Civil War ended in 1865, he had no idea that the war was over. After all, there were no newspapers and no other people lived within miles of his cabin. In 1866, a family named Sears, who lived near Miami, had sailed north to Sand Point to purchase supplies. On their return voyage down the coast, they noticed that heavy rains had broken up open a natural inlet into Lake Worth. They sailed through the inlet to explore Lake Worth. To their great surprise, they found Lang living all alone like a hermit in his cabin. When Lang asked how the war was going, the Sears family told him that it had ended a year earlier. Shortly thereafter, Lang abandoned the cabin and moved north. He had successfully avoided the entire war. Now, we were thinking about moving into Lang's cabin. It wasn't nearly as nice as the Lighthouse. The whole cabin was made of lumber that had probably been salvaged from a shipwreck. The roof looked just like a Seminole roof. It was made of dried palmetto fronds. There were a few empty bottles and cans littering the floor, and turtle shells, animal bones, and firewood were scattered around outside. "Well," said Papa. "I don't know," Mama said. "It's not very well kept, is it? And it's pretty small with just one room for the three of us." "Surely," said Papa, "there's not much room for a family here." Papa looked around a little more, then shook his head. "No," he said, "we can do better than this." So we sailed south once again. The The lake was about 25 miles long, and we had explored only the first 5 or so miles. Over the next 2 days, we sailed all the way to the bottom of the lake looking for the best place to live.
Now we have Chapter 8, Our House on Hypalexo Island, read by Maddie Oberting.
Chapter 8, Our House on Hypalexo Island. You never do things the easy way, Mama said for the 10th time. Well, it makes sense to me, Papa answered a little grumpily. We were standing on a narrow strip of land that Papa had decided should be our new home. It was an island, and, as Mama had pointed out many times, there was no bridge between us and the shore. No one else lived on the island, and as far as we could see, no animals lived here either. The way I see it, Papa said, this is the perfect place to put down roots. We're protected by the lake, just in case any bears get it in their minds to pay us a visit, and we'll have plenty of fresh water. Mama grumbled. Let's just hope we don't need to go anywhere very fast. No one asked me, but I thought Papa had picked a fine spot to live. I liked the idea of living on an island surrounded by the clear, warm water of Lake Worth. As we'd been sailing down the lake, I'd seen dozens of fish, some almost as big as me, shooting through the water, and there were always flocks of birds flying above. The island Papa picked was about 2/3 of the way down Lake Worth. He said he wanted to build our house on the highest point on the south end of the island. Uncle Will and his family could build their house on the north end of the island. Uncle Will was supposed to join us a few days later. We camped out until Uncle Will arrived. He and Papa left right away and returned to Jupiter to bring the Victor II back, this time by ocean. Miraculously, all of our possessions in the Victor II survived the hurricane relatively undamaged. When Papa and Uncle Will returned, Papa announced that he was going to start the house. He said he was going to build a fortress that could survive any hurricane. This he did. Our house stood for almost 100 years and withstood countless hurricanes. But it also took a lot of extra work to build a hurricane-proof house. First, we had to scavenge lumber and wood from the beach. A hurricane 3 years earlier had caused many ships to wreck, and their cargoes and pieces of their hulls were strewn from miles up and down the sand. Once we found a piece of wood we liked, we had to drag it sometimes for miles up the beach, through the jungle, and over the bridge ridge, and then raft it across the lake to the island. It took almost 3 weeks to collect all of the wood we needed, and we camped out those 3 weeks under a tent Uncle Will brought for us. As we combed the beach looking for lumber, we also found all sorts of useful articles, including bolts, nails, and pieces of copper and brass. This made Papa happy because he could sell the copper and brass by the pound to Mr. Titus, who owned the store at Sandpoint. Although almost 120 miles away, it was the nearest store we could purchase flour, coffee, sugar, and ammunition, which were all essentials. Papa selected only the very best timbers for our house. The corner posts were 10 inches by 12 inches, about triple the size of corner posts on any house in Chicago. The corner posts were the cross beams from ship's holes and had been treated with some type of tar to prevent water rot and insect infestation. After he got the post to the island, Papa worked for days to dig into the solid limestone under the topsoil. He dug holes 2 feet deep, and then he and Uncle Will sunk the corner posts in the stone. They next framed in the walls with timbers that were 6 inches by 9 inches. The wall studs were 4 inches by 4 inches, double the size of wall studs used in houses elsewhere. The roof was a whole different kind of problem. There were no shingles on the beach, so we had to do what the Seminoles did. We cut and dried palmetto fronds and layered them over each other to create a roof. The palmetto fronds were plentiful and easy to use, but neither me nor Mama liked our new roof very much. The first problem was that the palmetto fronds rotted quickly, and Papa had to replace the roof every 2 to 3 years. The other big problem was cockroaches, which were called palmetto bugs for a good reason. They like to live in palmetto fronds. The first time a big black roach dropped from the ceiling, Mama almost yelled herself hoarse, and I ran screaming from the house. No matter how much time I spent in the woods with tiger bow legs, I never got used to the roaches, and now I have to live with dozens of them in the roof of my house. Then, one day I heard Mama shriek, but it wasn't because of another roach. There was a red snake up on the rafters. Papa came running in when he heard her holler, and he laughed when she pointed out the snake. "That's good news," Papa said. "You watch, the snake eats cockroaches. In no time at all, I bet he'll take care of your little bug problem." Sure enough, in just a few days, roaches stopped dropping from the ceiling, and Mama declared that the little red snake was part of the family. She even named it Orion, after the great hunter in Homer's Odyssey. From that point onward, we had much less of a cockroach problem. 2 months after moving onto the island, we had our first visitors. It was a group of 3 Seminole men who had appeared in our yard in that strange, silent way that Seminoles have of traveling. One of the Indians hailed Papa. He knew us from the Lighthouse. "Pierce," he asked, "what you make?" The Seminole pointed at the hutch Papa was building. A hutch was a special building used to store dry foods like flour and sugar. It was built on raised legs like stilts, and the legs were sunk into buckets of turpentine. The turpentine smelled awful, but bugs like roaches and ants couldn't climb through it, so it protected the dry goods. "It's a cage to keep my takey and yatuches," Papa answered. The 3 Seminoles looked confused for several moments before they saw Papa's grin and knew that he was only kidding. The Seminole then asked Papa how long we had been on Hypoluxo. "Hypoluxo," said Papa. "What does that mean?" One of the Seminoles waved at the lake and said, "Means water all around. No, get out." "Oh," said Papa, shading out the sun with his hand so he could look around the island. "We call it an island, but I like Hypoluxo better. It has a nice ring to it." From that day onward, we too called it Hypoluxo, as it is known to this day.
It's Christmas, Chapter 9, A Christmas to Remember, read by Harrison Fisher.
Chapter 9, A Christmas to Remember. Papa and Uncle Will finished the house in early fall, and everyone agreed it was a very strong house. Once the roach problem was fixed, Mama said she was especially happy it was a dry house too. It rained almost every day in September, but the palmetto roof kept the water out. Pretty soon, it was almost Christmas time. Back in Chicago, Christmas had been my favorite holiday. We saw Mama's big family. Then, one day Papa announced that we had been invited to Mr. Lachlan Reed's house for Christmas. Mr. Reed was a bachelor, which meant he didn't have wife or kids. I was disappointed to hear that, but Papa said Mr. Reed had moved into Lang's abandoned shack up the lake, and even though he was a bachelor, he wanted our whole family to come over for the holiday. So on Christmas Eve, we packed the Victor II and sailed north. We set out the day before Christmas because the trip could take a long time if we did not have favorable wind. Luckily, we had good wind from the south, and we made a really good time. As was custom in those days, if we visited another person's home, we had to bring our own bedding mats and mosquito netting so that we could sleep on the floor of the host's home. Locke, as everyone called him, had cleaned Lang's abandoned cabin up nicely. The fruit trees were tended again, and the vegetables were growing in the flat areas of the beach ridge. As soon as we got there, I stuck my hand out and said, "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Reed," just like Mama had shown me. But Mr. Reed just laughed and said, "Call me Locke, young man. I think I've got something you might like. Follow me." He took me back to the yard and showed me a cage made from bamboo. Inside the cage, I saw the fattest possum I'd ever seen. And I'd seen a lot of fat possums in the woods since moving to Florida. Locke looked at the possum happily. "I'd caught him nigh a month ago," he said. "I've been feeding him sweet potatoes ever since." "You know what his name is?" "No, sir. I call him Christmas Dinner." Then Locke laughed so hard, I thought I saw him crying a little bit. When we went back inside, he told Mama that he cooked up the best possum any man alive. And if she were interested, he would show her his own special recipe. Mama didn't seem too thrilled about learning to cook a possum, but I'll admit I was pretty hungry and ready to try some of his roasted Christmas possum. On Christmas morning, we didn't go to church like we normally would have done in Chicago. There was no church anywhere around. Instead, Locke went outside and brought the possum cage inside. Papa said a short prayer over the possum, and we all thanked Locke for thanking God for giving us such a wonderful meal on Christmas. Then Locke took the possum back outside, and pretty soon Christmas dinner was gutted and skewered on a spit that turned slowly over the wood fire. For once, I had the whole day to myself. No lessons, no chores. Papa and Uncle Will sat with Locke on the tiny porch while Mama busied herself with a little sewing and talking to Locke about food. It turned out that Locke knew almost as much as Mama did about cooking. He even said that he had a recipe for an alligator tail that was so good it tasted like fresh young chicken. I wasn't so sure about that, but Tiger Bowlegs had also had alligator meat that was really good, so I figured it probably was. At noontime, we sat around a rickety wooden table and waited while Locke brought another platter over with the roasted possum claws draped over the sides. I'd been hungry while the possum cooked, but when I saw it on the table, my appetite disappeared. Locke had left the head and the legs and even the claws on the big fat possum, or at least he'd taken it off the spit. I saw Mama and Papa looking a little nervous also, but Locke just laughed and picked some of the meat off the possum. "Trust me," he said. And he was right. Once we started eating it, Mama declared it was the finest possum she'd ever have. Of course, Mama, like Papa and me, had never had possum before. However, the meat tasted like fresh young pig and was so delicious. Mama also made her famous biscuits, which were smothered in fresh cane syrup that had been sent to us by Captain Miles Burham in Cape Canaveral. For dessert, we had a prickly pear pie. Prickly pears are the bright red fruit that grow on cactus. The sandy pine woods of High Paluxo Island were covered with cactus, so Mama usually had plenty of prickly pears. The color was bright and beautiful, but the taste was a little boring. I thought prickly pear pie looked a lot better than it tasted. Mama usually had to add a lot of sugar to make it good. After Christmas dinner, we sailed back home again, and I was a little sad to say goodbye to Locke, but mostly I was just lonely. Besides, Uncle Will on the other end of High Paluxo Island, nearest neighbors, were a boat ride away. There were no kids anywhere near our house, and I missed Tiger Bowlegs every day. Our life on Lake Worth was simple in lots of ways. Papa didn't have any glass when he built our house, so our windows were just open, in holes in the walls with curtains and shutters. This did nothing to keep the mosquitoes out. At night, we couldn't light candles or lanterns because the light attracted mosquitoes. You could almost hear them buzzing in your sleep. The worst mosquitoes were called no-see-ums. No-see-ums were very, very tiny mosquitoes with a very big bite. Mama said she was nearly driven crazy by no-see-ums because they were impossible to see. So we burned smudge pots that filled the house with foul-smelling smoke to keep the mosquitoes away. We spent many a night sitting in our dark house, inhaling the pot fumes while remembering our family and friends back in Chicago. Our condition distressed relatives, Papa's family in New England, could not understand why we chose to live in such primitive conditions. Mama's family was even more worried. Her mother was a school teacher and was afraid that I was going to be raised with no education. As a result, they sent books whenever they could. The problem was that there was no regular mail service. The nearest post office was 120 miles north at Sand Point. Sometimes we didn't receive mail for months at a time. Only when Papa or someone else on the lake decided to sail to Sand Point, or when someone sailed down there with a bundle of mail. Grandma didn't have to worry. Mama almost never missed a chance to give me a lesson. She taught me grammar, reading, mathematics, and science. And I read more than most children my age. more than I would have ever read back in Chicago. I especially liked the Greek myths, and I also read a new book called Roughing It by Mark Twain. It was about Mr. Twain's travels through the West. I wondered what Mr. Twain would think of me being stuck in a hurricane all night. When I wasn't working with Mama, Papa taught me about the stars and how clouds could make rain and how the moon pulls the ocean to create tides. We started planting. I'd worked with Papa in the vegetable patch, and he taught me about crossing different kinds of plants with each other to make new, stronger kinds. I was also a crack shot with my rifle, could tie any type of knot, rig any sail, and pilot any boat. I had also learned to speak some Miccosukee, the language of the Seminoles. Life on the Lake Worth was not bad at all. It was just different.
And now, Reese continues reading Chapter 10, The Orange Grove House of Refuge.
Chapter 10, Orange Grove House of Refuge. In late 1875, the United States Life Saving Service announced that it was building 5 buildings along the lower east coast of Florida for the purpose of housing shipwrecked persons. The buildings would be called houses of refuge. The northernmost house of refuge was built first along Bethel Creek in what is now Vero Beach. The second house of refuge was called Gilbert's Bar and was about 15 miles north of Jupiter Lighthouse. In the winter of 1876, the federal government began construction of House of Refuge No. 3, which became known as the Orange Grove House of Refuge because it was located near a grove of sour wild oranges that some believe that the Spanish had planted several hundred years ago. It was built along a wide stretch of beach about 8 miles south of our house on Hypoluxo Island. Many years later, the area around the Orange Grove House would become known as Delray Beach. The Orange Grove House was completed in late April 1876 and needed a full-time keeper. Papa agreed to become the first keeper, and we moved in the first week of May. The move was a little disruptive because we were now used to our home on Hypoluxo Island, where Uncle Will lived on the other end of the island, and we had neighbors a few miles up the lake. At the Orange Grove House, we would have no neighbors at all. Moreover, Mama was expecting a baby in 3 months. An isolated house on the beach was no place to give birth to a baby. Before we moved south to the House of Refuge, Papa sent for a Negro lady named Aunt Betsy. Aunt Betsy was not really my aunt, but we called her that. She had been a slave and had escaped to Florida from her master's plantation in Georgia during the Civil War. Papa and Mama had befriended her during the brief time that we lived near Fort Pierce. Papa wanted Aunt Betsy to come down from her home on the Indian River near Fort Pierce and take care of our house on Hypoluxo Island while we were there at Orange Grove House. Just about the time we were ready to move, Aunt Betsy arrived. We left the house on Hypoluxo Island in her capable hands and moved south to Papa's new job on the beach. Life at Orange Grove House was exciting. I spent my days on the beach, fishing, collecting turtle eggs, and hunting in the Spanish River Lagoon on the other side of the beach ridge to the west. Nights were spent enjoying the gentle breezes rolling off the ocean. During May, June, and July, the giant loggerhead, green, and leatherback turtles came ashore at night to lay their eggs. Each morning, I would find fresh mounds of sand containing sometimes hundreds of large turtle eggs. Turtle eggs became a staple in our diet, as did turtle meat. Mama made excellent turtle stew. It turned out we weren't the only ones who liked turtle eggs. Almost every evening during turtle nesting season, black bears would come out over the beach dunes from the woods looking for nests of fresh turtle eggs. When they found a nest, the bears would patiently dig up and crack open the eggs, drinking the contents from the eggshell like a human drinking out of a coconut. Every once in a while, Papa would shoot a bear if it got too close to the House of Refuge. When he did, we ate bear steaks and salted the rest of the meat to save it. One day, I was down on the beach when I heard a familiar voice calling, "Charlie, Charlie!" I turned around and could scarcely believe my eyes. Tiger Bowlegs was coming over the beach dune after he and his father had stopped at the Orange Grove House. I knew that the Seminoles traveled the Spanish River, and I hoped to one day see Tiger Bowlegs again, but I was still surprised. "You're taller," he said, looking up at me and grinning. "You're not," I answered, laughing a little. "Maybe no, but I could still wrestle you." Tiger's father agreed that they could stay for a few days. Papa said they could stay in the House of Refuge. We had plenty of room, as the attic was designed to sleep up to 20 shipwreck victims at a time. But Tiger's father refused to sleep in a house. Instead, Tiger and his father camped out on the beach. That first night, Mama let me sleep on the beach with Tiger and his father, and we sat by a small fire until the moon was high in the sky. The next morning, Tiger and I set out just after dawn in his dugout canoe. I had old Lauderdale with me, and we were hoping to track some buck. Tiger said he and his father had seen deer droppings up the river and he thought that there would be big buck in the area. We found a good place to hide in the pines and waited silently for a few hours until finally a huge buck appeared in the trees. It was by far the biggest deer I'd ever seen, and I raised my rifle to shoot. But Tiger held up his hand and motioned for me to stop. He nodded at me and his dark eyes glistened with excitement. "Wait," he was saying. So I waited. It seemed like it took forever, but the big buck slowly began to pick his way toward us through the woods. As he got nearer and nearer, my heart pounded with excitement. He had a 10-point rack, and he must have weighed at least 250 pounds. I'd never even heard of a buck that big in South Florida. Finally, Tiger nodded to me, and in one swift motion, I raised the rifle, sighted along the barrel, and dropped the deer with one shot to the neck. "Nice shoot," Tiger said. "You made good Indian." We dragged our prize buck back to the canoe. He was so heavy that we could drag him only a few feet at a time. When we almost put him in the canoe almost sank. Pretty soon, we were back at the house of refuge, and I was excited to show Papa our deer. Papa wasn't outside, as I expected, so I ran up the house. Papa met me at the door, and I knew right away that something was going on. Papa looked as if he had seen a ghost and wasn't paying attention when I told him that I shot a huge deer. "What's going on, Papa?" I asked. Then he smiled. "Charlie," he said, "you've got a baby sister." It turns out Mama had gone into labor while I was gone and given birth to Lily Elder. It was August 1876, and Lily was the first white girl ever born between Jupiter and Miami. I decided that my deer was a good sign, and I told Papa that we could put the rack of antlers in Lily's room so that the spirit of the giant buck would watch over her. He thought that was a fine idea, and later that day, he and Tiger's father helped us dress out the deer. As was the custom, we split the meat, and Tiger's father ended up taking as much as he could carry. The next morning, Mama was very ill. She lay in bed with a high fever, shaking and sweating in bed. Papa tried everything he knew, but it wasn't working, so he called me into the room. Mama was white like a sheet, and when I got near her, I could feel the heat pouring off of her skin. "Go get Aunt Betsy," Papa ordered. I ran up the beach as fast as I could. I ran the entire 8 miles and swam across the lake to Hypoluxo Island. Getting Aunt Betsy back was a lot slower, though, as she was overweight and middle-aged and not used to walking in the soft sand along the beach. I ended up carrying her big sack of herbs and potions. When we got back to the house of refuge, Aunt Betsy took one look at Mama and shook her head. "Don't know if I can help her, but I'll try," she said. Aunt Betsy knew slave medicine, or African medicine. She fished in her bag and withdrew a few small sacks of herbs. She crushed them first, then boiled them together. It smelled awful, and I think Papa was afraid to ask what was in the potion. When she was done, she strained the potion through the white sheet, muttered a few words over it, and then told Papa it was good African medicine and to give the drink to Mama right away. Mama could barely drink it, and it looked as if she might spit it back out. But eventually she swallowed it. Then she went right to sleep. She slept for almost 24 hours straight. Father was fit to be tied, waiting for her to wake up. He did not eat or sleep a wink. I knew what he was thinking. He was angry at himself again. Why he had brought his beautiful wife to this wilderness where there were no doctors and no hospitals. How would he live without her if she died? Who would raise Lily? How would he explain her death to Uncle Will and Mama's parents? He nearly paced a hole in the floor in the house of refuge. Then the following day, Mama woke up, and although tired, was nearly her old self again. She slowly regained strength over the next couple of weeks, and Aunt Betsy stayed by her side until she was fully recovered. After 2 weeks, I walked Aunt Betsy back up to the beach, across the lake, and to the house on Hypoluxo Island. By anyone's estimation, Aunt Betsy had saved Mama's life.
Chapter 11, The Big Rain, read by Maddie Oberting.
Chapter 11, The Big Rain. After Mama was better, Papa announced he had to sail up to Sandpoint to restock our supplies. It was late summer and we were running low. While he was gone, the rest of us, me, Mama, and Lily, were going to move back to the house on Hypoluxo Island and live with Aunt Betsy. He figured he would be gone a couple of weeks. Not much had changed on Hypoluxo Island, but Uncle Will said that more and more people were coming around the area to homestead. A week later, I saw what he meant when I spotted a boat filled with men, women, and children heading south down the lake toward the island. The boat contained the Dimmick and Gear families. They were from Illinois and had just arrived to take up homestead further north. They had sailed down to St. Augustine with all their furniture and possessions loaded on their large sailboat, which was anchored offshore. They planned to raft all their furniture and possessions ashore, then store everything someplace dry while they built houses for themselves. When Uncle Will heard this, he said they better get their stuff off the sailboat real quick because the weather in September can be dangerous. For the next 3 days, Uncle Will helped the Dimmicks and the Gears unload their possessions. They stashed some of their things in the hammock on the west side of the beach dune, and they brought some to our house. We didn't know either family before this, but we were happy to help out. They were pioneer settlers like us, and Papa said it was important to help all the pioneers, especially ones who were about to become neighbors. I never met families as tight as the Dimmicks and the Gears. I couldn't keep it all straight because it seemed that every Dimmick was a cousin or in-law to every Gear. Mama explained it a few times. She said that 2 Dimmick brothers had married sisters from the Gear family, and no Gear man had married a Dimmick woman. So all 6 of the adults were either siblings or in-laws, and all their children were cousins. They were 13 of them in all. Somehow, Mama found a place in the house for all the women and children. The men camped outside in the yard. A few days after they arrived, I was at the north end of the island helping Uncle Will rig his sailing skiff when 2 Seminoles pulled along the shoreline in a canoe. As usual, we did not see or hear them coming. I first thought they were here to trade with us, and I saw their canoe was empty. Uncle Will greeted them. "What can I do for you?" he asked. One of the Seminoles shaded his eyes against the sun. "Here to warn you," he said. "Flowers on Sawgrass closing up. This means big rain coming." Uncle Will looked alarmed, even though the sun was shining and the only wind was a gentle breeze from the northwest. Big rain was in their term for a hurricane, and we knew better than to doubt the Seminoles. Personally, I would have been happy to never see another hurricane after my first one. "Thank you," Uncle Will said. And the Seminoles got back in their canoe and paddled west, back towards the Everglades. Unfortunately, there wasn't much we could do to protect ourselves if a hurricane really was coming. The house was already jammed full of people and their things, so we cleaned up the property the best we could, tied down the boats, folded and packed the sails, and hoped the Seminoles were wrong. But they weren't. By the early afternoon, the wind had changed directions, and the skies turned black. Uncle Will and I ran for the house. The Dimmicks and the Gears had no idea what a hurricane was, but they looked plenty scared. Uncle Will and I were tying their furniture down on the porch when I spotted Papa sailing down the lake toward us. Papa looked intense, and he had his full sails out and was running before the wind as fast as he could. He tied up the boat, jumped ashore, and said that he had just come from the Jupiter Lighthouse on his way back from Sandpoint. While at the lighthouse, he saw Tiger's father, who told him a hurricane was coming. Papa knew to listen to the Seminoles, as they had been accurately predicting the weather for generations. After we tied everything down, there was nothing to do but wait and hope. So we sat in the darkness with a few candles flickering and prayed while Aunt Betsy sang quietly. But the first storm came upon us quickly, just like the first time. By 4 o'clock, the winds were howling, and the rain was being driven horizontally across the yard. In the midst of all of this, several older families from further up the lake arrived at our house and begged us to give them shelter. They knew that Papa had built the sturdiest home anywhere in South Florida. Of course, Mama and Papa welcomed them into our already full house. By nightfall, 21 people were in the house, including the children. This was probably the largest single gathering of settlers in South Florida up until that time. Pretty soon, I could hear the wind whistling through the branches outside. I knew this was a sign of a big hurricane. Only the big ones have strong enough winds to cause a high-pitched whistle. It was a strange and awful sound, and it struck fear into us. Every time thunder boomed outside, I jumped. Underneath the whistling, I heard the steady roar of waves pounding the beach and rain and lake water battering the house. The house itself shivered, and it felt as if the whole structure might lift off its foundation and fly into the lake. Papa and I tried to keep the newcomers calm, but it was hard to act brave when I was nervous too. At one point, Papa tried to tell them that he was not worried about the house blowing down as long as the trees were still standing. But then I peeked outside the shutters and saw that every tree in our yard had been snapped in half. The trunks of some of the great mastic and banyan trees were at least 8 feet thick in the middle of at least 200 years old. I immediately closed the window and didn't tell anyone what I had seen. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, the wind shifted, and we knew that we were now on the backside of the hurricane. The eye of the storm must have just passed the south of us. We spent the rest of the night listening to the strong winds and trying to sleep. By daybreak, the rains had ended and the winds were calm. It had been a long, tiring night, and some of the smaller children were still asleep. A few of the adults and I wandered outside, and we could scarcely believe our eyes. Every single tree had fallen and every plant stripped clean of leaves. There was hardly anything green left. Our vegetable patch was completely destroyed. Worse yet, everything the Dimmicks and the Gears had left on our porch was spread far and wide down the island. One of their dressers was even floating on the lake. After the helping the Dimmicks and the Gears collect their possessions, or at least what was left of them, I crossed the lake and went over the beach dune to see what the hurricane might have deposited on the beach, or whether any ships had been wrecked or people were in need of help. Fortunately, there were no shipwreck victims in need of aid. Unfortunately, there was not a single item of cargo on the beach to be salvaged. There were fish of every color, size, and variety, which we had collected and took home to eat. Later that day, Will Lanehart, a pioneer settled who lived north of us, came down the beach with a flamingo he had killed. Flamingos were not native to this area, and all we could figure was that the hurricane carried it from the Bahamas Island.
And our final chapter, chapter 12. Our reader is Afra, Our Lady of Santa Marta. Afra?
Chapter 12, Our Lady of Santa Marta. I couldn't believe the destruction the hurricane had caused along the beach. Before the storm, the beach was probably 1,000 feet wide from the waterline to the top of the beach dune. After the storm, it was only about 200 feet wide. In addition, sand to a depth of at least 10 feet had been washed away, and I could see huge rocks and ancient reefs that used to be covered by sand. It wasn't just I who was confused. Many deer, bear, and wild hogs were wandering aimlessly around the beach dune. I guess they were confused and lost. Most animals use smells to mark the boundaries of their territories. As best I could figure, the storm stripped the leaves, branches, and bark off nearly every tree and bush, and probably removed whatever scent the animals use to define boundaries and navigate by. I walked for miles up the beach towards Jupiter, hoping to find something that had washed up. About halfway between Hypoluxo Island and the Jupiter Inlet, I saw an odd-shaped structure sticking out of the ground in the middle of the beach. Even from a distance, I knew it couldn't be a rock. As I got closer, I realized it was a piece of a shipwreck. Finally, I might find something of value as a result of this disastrous storm. But this ship looked very odd. It didn't look like any ship I'd ever seen before, and it was mostly buried in the middle of the beach. How is this possible? How did the storm push a ship this far ashore and then bury it with sand at the same time the storm was eroding 10 feet of sand from the beach? I got on my hands and knees and began digging around the edges. I dug for almost an hour, trying to find the edges of the broken hull. I dug until I uncovered some writing on the hull. I could make out the words, but did not know what they meant. It said, Nuestra Señora de Santa Marta. I had no idea what the words meant, but I kept digging. In another few minutes, my fingers hit something hard. I soon uncovered the top of a box lying next to the hull. I dug faster, and before long, I could see the whole box. Actually, it was a chest. I tried to lift it, but it was too heavy. The chest was about 3 feet long by 2 feet wide, with a large metal latch inscribed with a cross. Since I couldn't move it, I lifted the latch and pushed the lid up. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. The entire chest was filled with hundreds of sparkling gold coins. They were unlike any coins I had ever seen. Each coin had a cross on one side, surrounded by strange markings and words that I could not understand. What I could understand, though, were the words Philip V and the dates, which ranged from 1711 to 1715. The chest was too heavy to lift or to carry, so I reburied it. I took one coin with me and ran as fast as I could back down the beach towards Hypoluxo Island. When I arrived at the house, I learned that Papa had already set sail back to the house of refuge, and the Dimmicks and the Gears were up the lake at their homesteads, beginning to clear the land to build their houses. This was just as well, because it would not have been wise to tell everyone about the treasure I had found. I told Mama the story of my find. I am not sure that she believed me until I showed her the coin that I brought back with me. When she saw it, her eyes grew large, and she took it slowly from my hand. "Mercy," she said, and caught her breath. "What is it?" She flipped it over and bounced it in her hand. "Charlie, you better go get your Uncle Will right now, and don't tell anyone else about this." I found Uncle Will repairing hurricane damage to his house. When I told him I found a buried trunk full of gold coins, he dropped his hammer onto the ground and hurried back with me. Along the way, he asked me every kind of question he could think of about the buried ship and the coins. When he saw the coin, he looked even more shocked than Mama. He bit it and left tooth marks in the metal. "Charlie," he said, "this is gold. How many of these are there?" "I don't know," I answered. "A few hundred, I guess." "A few hundred?" Uncle Will looked like he was about to fall over. He wanted to leave right then to go back to the shipwreck, but Mama announced it was too dark for us to walk up the beach alone, especially with confused animals roaming around. Uncle Will said he knew that Philip V was the King of Spain in the early 1700s, but he had no idea what a Spanish ship with a chest full of gold coins was doing buried on the beach in Florida. I hardly slept that night. As soon as the sun broke over the horizon, I was dressed and out the door, running up the muddy trail that connected our house to Uncle Will's. Together we rowed Uncle Will's small boat, Bessie B, across the lake, hiked through the jungle on the beach ridge, and began our long walk north. Uncle Will brought ropes and a knife so that we could cut some branches, bind them together into a sled, and drag the chest home. It took us several hours to reach the wreck site. Less of the ship was visible than the day before. The ocean was already beginning a steady reburial of the ship, with each crashing wave at high tide depositing more sand on the beach. It took a little extra digging to find the chest, but I didn't care about the extra work as long as we found it. While I dug, Uncle Will searched the jungle on the other side of the beach dune for sturdy tree limbs to construct the sled. After a couple of hours' work, the chest was out of the ground, and the sled was built. We wanted to dig around the wreck site to look for the possible treasure, but it was getting late, and we were worried that dragging the heavy sled would put us home after dark. We decided to head home and return the next day to look for more loot. We arrived home just after nightfall. Mama had sent a message down to the Orange Grove house with one of the gear boys shortly after Uncle Will, and I had left that morning. The message said nothing of the treasure. It only said, "Urgent, return home at once." So by the time Uncle Will and I dragged the chest out of the Bessie B and up the porch steps, Papa was standing on the porch waiting for us. We brought the chest into the house, opened it, and began sorting through the coins by candlelight. We counted 456 solid gold coins. Papa said that any one of them would make a poor man rich. Then Papa remembered a story he'd heard from Captain Armour, who had heard it from treasure hunters passing by the lighthouse. In late July 1715, a flotilla of 11 Spanish ships, each loaded with gold, silver, and emeralds from South America, set sail from Havana, Cuba. But a few days into the voyage back to Spain, the fleet was thrown off course by a massive hurricane and smashed into the shallow reefs off Florida's east coast. More than 1,000 Spanish sailors died, and all 11 ships were destroyed. The Spanish sent rescue and salvage ships from Havana and the Spanish fort Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine to rescue the survivors and salvage the treasure. However, the Spanish were able to locate only 10 of the 11 ships. The ship they never found was named Nuestra Señora de Santa Marta, which means Our Lady of Santa Marta. "That's the name of the ship I found," I exclaimed. Papa speculated that the Spanish never found the Santa Marta because it was much further south than the 10 other Spanish ships, which had wrecked along the beaches from the St. Lucie Inlet to the Sebastian Inlet. The Spanish probably had not thought to look so far south. Then the ship was buried under 10 feet of sand and disappeared. We inspected each of the 456 coins very closely. Over time, Papa and Mama ordered books about Spanish coins. They also sent sketches of the coins to one of Papa's brothers, who was a professor at Harvard near Boston, Massachusetts. After many months of ordering and reading books and corresponding with professors at Harvard, we learned that the coins were all made in Mexico and Nueva Granada, modern-day Colombia, between the years 1711 and 1715. The words on the coins translated to Philip V, by the grace of God, King of Spain and the Indies. Also, each coin was marked with 8S, which meant 8 escudos. These were the largest gold coins made by the Spanish and were referred to as doubloons by the English colonists because the coin was double the value of the 4 escudo coins. Forever afterwards, our family simply referred to them as doubloons. After a long night of counting and inspecting the coins, we went to bed. We planned to return to the wreck site the next day with Papa and shovels to see what else we could find. But we were awakened the next morning by a howling wind that slammed the shutters against the side of the house. The rain and strong winds lasted all day and into the next night. We couldn't go to our treasure search. The next day came and went, and it was still pouring rain. The third day came and went with no relief in sight. By the fourth day, the strong storm had passed and the sun was shining. Papa, Uncle Will, and I packed our digging tools and headed north up the beach. However, the beach was totally different. The 3 straight days of wind and waves from the northeast had returned all the sand to the beach. We could not find the wreck of the Santa Marta. We searched in vain for hours only to run out of daylight. We returned day after day, but to no avail. The autumn storms continued to pile more and more sand on the beach, burying our treasure ship deeper and deeper. As the foliage returned to the beach dune, it became more and more difficult for us to be certain we were even digging in the right part of the beach. After several weeks of searching in vain, Papa had to return to his job at the House of Refuge. Mama, Lily, and I went with Papa back to the Orange Grove house. Uncle Will returned to farming and tending to his gardens. The chest of 456 doubloons was buried in our backyard at the foot of a giant banyan tree and dug up only periodically over the next 3 generations, whenever someone needed to pay for something very important, such as more land or a new sailing boat. As for the Santa Marta, she is still there, buried since August 1715 in the sands of the beach between Hypoluxo Island and the Jupiter Inlet. Her remaining treasure, estimated by the Spanish crown to have been worth millions, has never been found. Her final resting place was known only by my family, and we never told anyone.
And that's it, my friends. We hope you enjoyed the story, The American Jungle by Harvey Oyer, a true Florida adventure. Adventures are still to be had today in modern Florida. Come visit us at the Ann Norton Sculpture Gardens.